Welcome to the Audible Genius podcast, where we take a behind-the-scenes look at being a musician. I'm Joe Hanley, and today I'm talking to Skye Lewin, an award-winning composer and producer, and currently audio director and composer at the video game company Bungie. We'll be taking an inside look at what it's like creating music for a major video game company, how it differs from traditional formats like film and TV, and the interesting ways video game composers use and sometimes create technology as they go. Let's get started. So, tell me a little bit about what you're doing now in music.
I'm primarily working in video games now with a company called Bungie and working on the score for a game called Destiny, which is a pretty fun playground for a composer because it's pretty diverse. It's got a lot of different areas in the universe and a lot of opportunities to score with different palettes and things like that. So it's been a really fun opportunity.
Yeah, that seems so interesting to me, like the composing for a video game. How long have you been composing for video games?
Not that long, actually. I never intended to get into video games. I was actually doing music for other media and TV and film, and sort of got into video games by a happy accident. But I'm very glad that I did. It's actually been a really fun, I keep saying fun, but it's been a really engaging medium because there's more dynamic problem solving than something like linear media, because it's not always going to be experienced the same way. So you have to preemptively plan out how the music is going to function if different circumstances occur, which I really enjoy.
So the music changes depending on like what the user does in the game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if most people have played video games, and if you do a different thing at a different time, the music has to follow you instead of like, if it were a film, there's a certain amount of time between each cut and things, obviously there's changes that happen during the creation of a film, but like once it's final, it's the same every time you watch it. Whereas a video game is not. That dynamic nature of making it still sound good is really fun.
Is it like, do you have entire blocks of music, say, waiting for a certain moment? Like, okay, if the user does this, then it's going to play this music. If he does that, he'll play that music. Or is it more like granular?
It can be both. It really just depends on the way that a particular activity is going to be set up, and all of that is really informed by what the goal of that activity, what is it that we're trying to convey, or that the experience is, what does the music need to support in the experience, and how we might change the way that it plays back to support that experience is really based on things like the narrative and the mood and all the things that are trying to be conveyed by the score, all the things that the game is trying to say, basically.
So can you give me an example maybe of something you did recently, something you were composing on recently?
Yeah, we released the expansion called Witch Queen for Destiny 2, the Witch Queen, in February earlier this year. And that was, like most of the stuff we do, that's a collaborative effort between me and the other composers we work with. But there's a fairly significant chunk of score in that release, and it was very much targeted at a specific vibe and mood and storyline and specific characters, and that meant specific themes and palette that like I mentioned earlier, kind of help expand the universe of Destiny, which is always, at least from a creative standpoint, one of the more engaging parts of the process, because there's always something new. It's not like you're necessarily always going back to the one same melody and trying to reimagine it. There's always some spin that expands that. There might be a new melody that's necessary for a new character or for a new storyline or something like that. And so that's one of the recent scores that we've worked on.
So you'll have like different pieces of music that are sort of attached to different characters that will come back if that character comes back into the game?
Yes, sometimes, but I kind of would call that more like Peter and the Wolf, where each character has a specific theme or a very specific sonic element or mnemonic. All games are different. Some games have more of that, some have less. Ours has some of that, but it's largely more tied to broader narrative or contextual elements rather than specific characters. But sometimes the narrative element might be tied to or very linked to a specific character. And so the theme might represent multiple things or more than one thing.
On this thing you just released, how many composers are working on that?
I think we had 6 composers contributing. So the 4 in-house composers, myself, Michael Salvatore, Josh Mosser, Michael Seacrest, and then Rodem Moav and Peter Schlosser work with us as external composers. And so we all kind of collaborate and contribute to the broader swath that is the game score.
Do you kind of break it up, each of you getting a different like part of the game and then putting it together, or do you like literally collaborate on say the same piece of music at the same time?
We are pretty highly collaborative. Pretty much the way we approach things is I'll assign out different pieces of music, or what we would call a producing composer, whoever's producing a piece of music is responsible for the actual production of it. And sometimes we'll actually do a lot of hands-on collaboration where a cue is literally all of us at the same time working on it. Other times it's round robin where somebody starts it and passes it off to somebody else, and we just keep plugging away until we are like, okay, it's done. And other times one person's producing and driving it the whole time, but we're all giving input and weighing in. But the thing I love about that process the most is that the collaboration and the fact that we get multiple sets of ears on things always takes something to the next level. So one of us might come up with a really great theme and we're like, yes, that's the perfect theme for this thing. But then we make 3 or 4 little tweaks to it that wouldn't have been made, in a bubble if just one of us had made that happen on their own. And that takes it up a notch. And that's always a really rewarding thing to see, is just how the collaboration can always plus whatever it is you're working on.
Yeah, it sounds like such an interesting balance of like there's freedom and structure at the same time. So it sounds like you're constantly trying to kind of find a balance between those two things.
Yes, it sounds like life.
Yeah.
There's always a target. There's always a goal. There's always something that must be maintained in the score. So, if whatever cue has a very specific target of the mood has to be X, but the themes have to be Y and Z, fairly constant, but then there's always freedom in how we get there. And each person's take on that might vary a little bit, which is also really great. But then when we bring it in and, everybody puts their ears on it and we kind of tweak it, that really helps hone it in some cases. And in other cases, it might be as simple as, ooh, this melody is awesome, but let's change the rhythm of this one note and the pitch of that one note. And now it's even better. Can run the gamut of kind of any type of feedback. One of the things I think we all kind of like to do is just, we listen down, and if something bumps, like, ooh, that bothers me, let's figure out why and fix it. And a lot of times there's cues where we'll listen down and it's like, oh, that sounds great, I don't have any comments. And then, those are much closer to the finish line when we start. So it literally runs the gamut. But yeah, there's definitely guidelines, there's definitely targets, but there's also freedom in that.
And so in that group, you have one, as you said, a producing composer, and then the rest are composers.
No. We're all composers. We're all producing composers.
Okay.
My role, as the kind of creative director for the team, involves composing, but it also involves working with all of the composers and kind of making sure that they're all aiming at the same target. And so when I'm looking at what the needs are for a release, the score is going to be for each different thing. Part of that process is looking at how much each of the composers who can contribute to the release are able to contribute within the timeline given other constraints. And part of those have to do with other things that we do within the studio that aren't strictly composing. And part of those have to do with other releases that we release at the same time as the thing we're working on. And so that assignment of a producing composer is more like, okay, X person has this much bandwidth, Y person has this much bandwidth. So this person's really great at this type of thing. Let's have them take these 2 cues as the producing composer. That doesn't mean that they're not working on the other cues. That just means they're the ones driving the session, so to speak, as an engineer for that cue. But for a large part, almost everybody's involved with almost every cue in some way, whether it's as minimal as, you're quoting melodic themes written by a different composer in the cue or referencing them in some new way, or the hands-on, everybody's working on the cue all together. And so that kind of, the producing composer is more the person who is driving the session. It's kind of just our own internal terminology. Really doesn't mean anything because we're all working on all the score in, the same kind of ways, so to speak.
And is all the music done like in the box? Is there any live instruments?
Yeah, lots of live instruments. It depends on the sound of the score. Some of the score in our game is more electronic, and a lot of that you could call in the box. But the kind of meat and potatoes of our game is orchestral, and that is recorded live with an orchestra.
Oh, really?
We do record a lot of, other aspects of the score, like might be a solo soprano or hand percussion or harp or things that aren't necessarily always part of the orchestra, but that are still live. So it's always a hybrid, but I would say it leans more towards the orchestral side of things.
Okay, so like when you're writing for the orchestra, are you say maybe creating like a scratch track, like with just like a like a plug-in orchestra like to write, but then to generate a score and give it to them, or is it all like written down into a score and then you hear it for the first time with the orchestra?
Every composer works differently, but for our needs, we make pretty detailed mock-ups that sound fairly close to what the final thing will sound like, because we need to put those in the game and start, building and doing things with the actual assets before we can ever record them. And so our mock-ups, don't sound as good as a live recording, but they have the same melodies and the same general parts. So rather than just kind of doing a really basic mock-up, they're closer to a production. And then we work with a really great orchestration team, and they always take it, up a notch, whether that's making suggestions of like, hey, why don't you try doing this or double this part with, clarinet, or some little suggestion that we hadn't thought of. There's always pleasant surprises in there working with them.
Now, for any of our listeners who are interested in learning how to compose music inside a computer, like Skye and his colleagues do, I highly recommend Building Blocks. This is an online course that we've designed that will take you step by step through the compositional elements of production. You'll learn how to write the building blocks of beats, like drum patterns, bass lines, chord progressions, and melodies. And it all takes place in an actual online music studio where you create music as you go. Check it out at audiblegenius.com. All right, so that's where you are now. If we go all the way back to the beginning, what was the first thing that made you go from being just a listener of music to wanting to be a creator or a player of music?
Oh man, all the way to the beginning.
First thing you remember.
Oh man, that's way back. I guess earliest memories that drew me to music, riding in the car with my dad and listening to music and kind of picking out the beats and the melodies and like, oh, I like that. I don't know why, but I like it. I remember, mom listening to Stevie Wonder and just like, oh, that's catchy. Little person not really knowing anything else about it, but that it made you feel good.
Okay.
And as I grew up, my dad was a musician, so it was kind of always in the house, and I wasn't pressured to get into music, which was cool. I kind of was able to get into it on my own time. I think because of that, it really kind of just naturally grew into something that I loved. And, I was in school thinking, hey, what do I want to do after school? And, I liked other things too, but music kind of won out pretty early for me. So I knew that's where I was going, or where I wanted to spend my professional time pretty early on, fortunately.
Okay. What was the first instrument you played?
Recorder, probably.
Right. You and everyone else, right?
Yeah, but probably other things that I don't remember. But yeah, definitely that was one of the first, if not the first.
Did you ever take like private lessons when you were a kid in some instrument?
Yeah, I did. I took private lessons on guitar and drums, and I might have on piano for a little while, but I didn't really stick with piano, and now I regret that. So if somebody watching is questioning whether or not piano lessons are worth your time, they're worth your time.
As a piano player, I agree. But for you, like, why do you wish you had stuck to piano?
Well, especially composing and producing, being able to play things in on the piano is really useful with MIDI, especially. I play mallet percussion, vibraphone, and marimba, and so I understand and can get around a keyboard, but I don't have the finger coordination that a pianist has. Okay. So when I play piano, it's like, 4 or 5, maybe 6 notes at a time, and it's not as elegant as I would like. I can fake a piano performance, but I can't like play it live the way I wish I could. Right. So, I remember things like learning scales and basic piano class, but not the investment that I wish I had made for the fluidity that I wish I had gained with that instrument. So,
do you find yourself using mallet instruments nowadays as a compositional tool?
Yeah, I wouldn't say for I don't use like a MIDI trigger to play things in with mallets, but I will record live vibraphone occasionally. That's fortunately something I do have set up to record, and I love using it when it's right, but it's it's such a specific sound, you can't just throw it on everything.
So by the time you graduated high school, you knew you wanted to do music.
Yeah. Yeah, before then. And
so where did you go after high school?
While I was in high school, I was doing taking classes at the local college, and then I spent a year, I think about a year there, doing music education. Then transferred to Berklee College of Music in Boston, where I intended to go into music education, but got totally drawn in a different direction. Initially, was focused on their MP&E program, music production and engineering, and music synthesis, and I was doing a dual major in those. And then I switched to MP&E and performance, just because I wanted to keep the focus on performing and playing.
Got it. And of the teachers you had, Berkeley or high school or that local college, did any ever stick out to you? Sort of stick out to you now today as being a particularly important mentor?
Oh yeah, many of them. I think I could go back all the way there. There are things about pretty much every teacher I've ever had that stick with me, but one of my early drum teachers just had a unique way of kind of helping me get things, like understand the feel of things and how it worked. I don't talk to him that often, but I keep in touch with him from time to time. I think I spoke with him a few months ago. Another teacher I had a little later on kind of inspired me to get interested in mallet percussion, because at that time I was mostly focused on, drums and guitar and other instruments. And beyond that, was also one of the most influential teachers I've ever had, as far as like just getting technique, mastering the importance of technique. As with anything, whether it's playing an instrument or producing and engineering, you want to get the technique mastered to the point where it's secondary and it's not in the way of what you're trying to convey. And I learned that from this teacher. Many other teachers through my entire experience, Berkeley and after and before, and non-music teachers who have had lessons like that stick with me. But yeah, a lot of amazing teachers, and that's partly why I was at first interested in music education, because I loved seeing it stick. Whether it was me learning it and like, oh, that's how he or she was able to make me understand that concept. If I'm trying to convey this to someone else, like I used to teach private lessons to a few students when I was younger, and one of my favorite parts about it was always trying to find the way to convey it. And so I think that was one of the things that I always enjoyed about education, was kind of the means of finding that path for each person, because it is different for everybody.
Yeah. Did you find that like teaching, having to sort of figure out how to sort of explain things, did it help you in your own playing or performing or production?
Like with anything, if you have to be able to understand it well enough to convey it, it's going to help you. I guess it depends on what it is. If it's a tactile thing, especially if it's like technique, you have to be able to do it well enough to articulate how to do it. And so yeah.
And so you went to Berkeley thinking, I want to teach, and then your interest changed. You remember kind of what it was about, I guess, MP&E production and engineering, and what that drew you towards it?
Yeah, I can't remember the moment per se, but I always played in bands, had 4 tracks we'd record, got into the studio and recorded, and I always liked that part of the process, but I was always kind of, other than the 4-track, on the other side of the glass, so to speak, playing on the music or writing the music, and not necessarily focused on recording it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably, it was one of those moments of like being in a session, playing on something at Berkeley, and going on the other side of the glass and listening to it and looking at, oh, that's how they're making this stuff. That's really intriguing. I've done that on a 4-track, but that's not the same thing as this. I think it was probably just seeing the other side of it in a way that I hadn't seen before. And that really drew me to it. I mean, it's kind of like building something, but just orally, like little pieces at a time, putting them all together, making a vision come together with something intangible is really, it's like a puzzle, but you can't see the pieces. So you have to imagine them and then make them real. And I love that about the process. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that for sure.
Seeing somebody do that well probably is what drew me into it. I can definitely remember seeing certain people do it very well, but I'm not sure which one of those moments was like the thing.
So by the time you finished college, what was your sort of rough plan at the time? What did you want to do at that point?
I mean, I knew I wanted to keep doing something in music. I didn't know what I was going to be able to do. When you get out of college, it's like you kind of have to figure out whatever you can figure out, so to speak. I didn't know where I wanted to move or where I wanted to live, but I ended up moving out to LA because I had some extended family there, and it's nice and sunny, and there's a music industry there, all those
Right.
things. I obviously looked at other places too, and there were compelling reasons to potentially go to some of the other places, but I ended up in LA and just kept following that. Oh, this is what I want to do, so I'm gonna just keep doing this thing, and kept doing it.
So what were some of like the first professional opportunities? Where were the first ones that started showing up for you in LA?
Let's see. My first actual job out of college was as a runner at a recording studio, which is, if you know anything about what runners do, it's not a very glamorous job. You're getting coffee and picking up lunch orders and, cleaning the studio. Um, I did that for a while. Fortunately, was able to move into an engineering gig pretty quickly and was doing a lot of dialogue recording and editing, recording music, still played on music during all of that stuff. Playing on other people's projects as a performer. I mean, I was doing freelance projects, composing some stuff. I did a score for a children's video game that you actually played keys on a
Mm-hmm.
long time ago. During that period, and just kind of kept plugging away, and then kind of slowly moved into more TV and film stuff. Was doing records and writing songs on the side and composing, and just kind of doing all the things that were fun and that were enjoyable and were in or around music, and just kept at them, and one thing leads to another.
So just kind of being in that, like first being in that studio as a runner, you just kind of were meeting people, making little connections, getting little opportunities. And it was just slowly kind of growing from there.
Ironically, not so much from those connections, but I definitely kept in touch with some of the people from that, but none of the opportunities came out of that in specific. No, that was just more like the first opportunity that happened to line up, but all the other stuff kind of came out of other side projects and you know other things. I was never just doing one thing. Even if I had a main job, I was always still doing other things on the side, and lots of different projects, and sometimes one of those other projects would turn into something much bigger.
How did you go about getting those side projects at the beginning? If you just kind of moved to LA and you had family there, how were you sort of finding work?
Wow, I'm trying to remember how was that. Definitely through people that I knew, many of whom I knew through Berkeley, many of whom I met there, through different collaborations, different, go play on a record and somebody's like, oh, you do this thing? Oh, I need some help with, this mix. You want to take a crack at a mix? And then, one thing leads to another. But yeah, people you meet in life pop up in unexpected ways. I remember running into someone I met way back before I ever went to college, and we ended up working on a project, and things like that happen. You just never know.
Did you ever find yourself like suddenly in a professional opportunity and feeling kind of in over your head?
Oh yeah, every time you do something new. Yeah, I remember many times where that's happened, and it's always like ooh, I could take the easy way and just like, not really worry about it, or I could shed for a little while and figure this out. You're good at it all of a sudden, and then it's fine. But yeah, the first time I worked on a serious TV and film project, I was like, okay, I know enough to kind of do this, but I've never actually done it other than like a project, a school project at that point in my career. And it was like, okay, I'm just gonna have to bear down and do it, and put in the time. And it wasn't that much time in retrospect, but it felt like you know running into a wall to a degree, because you're like, it's out of your comfort zone. I think that's maybe more what it is. It's not like you're unable to do it. It's more just like it's not the thing you've always done, and so it's not just immediately
Mhm.
comfortable. Like you just do it. You don't do it in your sleep the first time, and then after that, you have to be careful not to do it in your sleep, because once it gets to the point where it's just that easy, you want to be careful that you're really giving it the proper attention and not getting too comfortable, so to speak. But yeah, if you're not feeling that uncomfortableness, you're not pushing the boundaries enough. We'll put it that way. Or at least that's my philosophy on it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know how that feels. Sometimes I'll be so nervous about doing something for the first time, and that makes me hyper vigilant, and then I get comfortable and maybe a little complacent. And do you ever, when you start to feel that complacency, do you ever like, have any tricks that you use to kind of kick yourself back into a sense of urgency, or it's just observing it and then you're fine?
Yeah. I mean, mostly just observing it, I guess.
Okay.
sometimes it depends on what it is. If you have the option to force yourself into uncomfortable territory. So it might be, you might be working on something and you have the option to change the palette of the score you're working on drastically. And now all of a sudden I'm scoring in some palette I've never used before. That's
Hmm.
going to force you to do that. But most of the time, you just kind of have to be cognizant of it, because you don't necessarily always have those types of opportunities, that they don't always line up with the need of the project that you're making. So
Do you have any ongoing sort of habits that help you keep sort of a steady state of mind to kind of handle the ups and downs of working in music?
no, if you figure some out, let me know. No. I mean, I guess so. Yeah, I sleep enough. I didn't for a long time. There were periods in my career where I would burn the candle at both ends for way too long. And I found that if I kind of force myself to at least get a consistent like 5 or 6 hours a night, preferably more, that kind of everything else was just easier. Um, the hard part about that is you never want to say no to projects, and sometimes you say yes to more than you can actually do, and unless you burn the candle at both ends. And so it's kind of trying to find that balance. I think I wouldn't call it a trick, but it's definitely something to also be aware of.
Did you find you kind of needed to push it a bit early on when you're still like, making a name for yourself? And then you could sort of start to say no more as you became more established?
Yes and no, but I think it also depends on the industry, especially in LA and in TV and film. It's like you say no and they go and find someone else, and you're not going to get a call from that that group of people again. I guess it's in that regard sometimes less about establishing yourself and more about just like, oh, that's a client that I definitely would want to continue working with. Is there any way that I can make that happen? And sometimes you just can't, like,
Mm.
and that's unfortunate. And other times you can, but it might mean, you know, bringing in other people and expanding a team, having more bandwidth than just one person by themselves can sustain healthfully. But it's all part of that. But yeah, definitely when you're getting started, there can be moments where saying no is, counter to kind of getting on your feet. And but usually when you're getting started, you don't want to say no to anything anyway. That's kind of more like
Right.
something that comes later. Um, Especially if you have a family, then it's like, oh, now I'm not getting any sleep for other reasons. There's only so many hours in the day, like that changes priorities in its own way. So
Right. Do you I once read that when releasing a game or like expansion pack for a game, there are like really insane deadlines. Do you experience that, where suddenly it's just like an intense period of time where you have to really like get a ton done? Or is it pretty balanced?
I think what you're referring to is probably called crunch in the games industry, and I think fortunately I have not had the level of crunch that probably happened in the old days, so to speak. But games, unlike TV and film, are kind of more of a new industry. Every studio is different. You know every studio might use a different set of tools and have a different process, and it's getting more standardized. But I think because you know it is more like the Wild West than other industries that involve music, there can be times where that happens. But I've been actually very fortunate with my experience in games where that's not happened that much. Yeah, there are deadlines, but having come out of TV and film where, you might have a TV show turnaround every week, that's actually, more of a pressure there, but it's like a known quantity, well-oiled machine in the TV world, in the film world, because that's a very established industry. The practices are standard, and, pretty much every production does things more or less the same way and has been for, decades, or probably close to a century now, over a century now. So, you know what I mean? Games are definitely still finding that rhythm. Um, but that's actually what's also engaging about it, because everything is unique and different, and there are places where you can kind of creatively stretch that maybe don't exist the same way in other medium that have been around for longer. So
How so? Like, is it because there's more room, there's less standardization, that you have more freedom
yeah,
to decide how it's going to be, and it allows you to stretch out a bit more?
yeah, imagine you're building a new game, and it needs to do something with the audio to support the experience. Maybe the tool to do that doesn't exist yet because nobody's had to do it. So you have to work with engineers to build it. And that's
Hmm.
not something that really happens as much in TV and film. It's more like, third party software, and or in the old days hardware, but you're using established tools. And unless you're in the development of those tools as your focus, there isn't really that type of interaction. And I'm sure that's not entirely true for everyone. I'm sure there are people who, both use the tools and help collaborate with people to make the tools. But for the most part, the average person working in, records or TV and film are using tools that have more or less been vetted, and they might beta test and, try new things, but they don't have to reinvent the wheel to make a project most of the time. And I think that's more common in games, even though it doesn't happen on every project either.
Well, that's really fascinating. So if you come across a situation where the existing tools aren't going to give you what you need, will there be someone in house at the company that you can kind of talk to, like, hey, let's make something that does this, or do you have to bring in someone outside?
I think every game studio is different. Again, it's kind of Wild West. So, and there are more and more third-party options for games now too. So things are, like I was mentioning, getting standardized on that front as well. I've heard of the gamut. People working on this internally, people bringing in external people working with a software company that might have a tool that's close to what they need to polish it and make it do a certain thing differently. Um, yeah, kind of all of the above.
Would this be like an actual tool, like an instrument plugin, or is it more something like coordinating between the music and the game, or could it be either of those things?
Yeah, could be either.
Okay.
I was referring to more the latter, like how the engine would play back music, how it would ingest
Okay.
information from the game, and how the music would then be triggered to react, or audio in general. But built instruments for some of our projects as well.
Oh wow.
In that case, we didn't do the building, but we recorded the samples and worked with people to have them help us build it. People who are more focused on, the technical side of that. But those kinds of collaborations are often useful to get, something custom and something unique that works for your project that nobody else would have.
Now, would that maybe be because you needed the actual sort of like a deep granular level of the music, the sound design to react to the game, like internal to the sound itself? Is you need the instrument to be able to kind of change its sound as you're moving through the game? Is that why you would need something like a custom instrument?
Or it could be that, or it could be as simple as you have a bunch of samples and it's just more efficient to perform them than it is to edit them. Um, but yeah, oftentimes being able to modulate things in real time is useful, because the context can be so different from project to project, or the needs of one project can vary so much from another. Those types of things are kind of unknown until you get into, like, how am I going to do this? Oh, there's a thing that does that already. Cool. Oh, there's not a thing that does that already. Okay, now what am I going to do? That's kind of the need behind it usually.
Now, for our listeners, we're talking about a very advanced and highly customized approach to sound design. If this is something you might be interested in doing, but you're brand new to sound design, one of the first things you need to learn is synthesis. For that, I highly recommend Centorial, which is another super effective course that we created. It'll take you by the hand and start from the very beginning, showing you how to design sound with a synthesizer. And it comes with a built-in soft synth that you'll make hundreds of patches on as you progress through the course. By the end, you'll be making your own sounds intuitively and completely by ear. Check it out at centorial.com. That sounds fun. I mean, like you said, it's like the Wild West. So each project is different from the last in terms of like how exactly it's going to play out.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, we have a fairly dialed in system with what we do, but is a lot of variance in games, is the broader in the broader industry is what I'm getting at. But and I say Wild West loosely. It's definitely getting more developed. It's like early 1900s now instead of 1850s kind of Wild West. But things are standardizing, but they're not fully standardized.
That's interesting because I mean, video games have been around since what, early 80s, I guess. Is that
Wow.
about when they
Yeah.
sort of started?
Yeah, maybe even late 70s. I embarrassingly don't know the dates of some of those things as well as I should, but yeah, it's somewhere in there.
I think my brother had a ColecoVision when I was like 2 or 3 or something like that, which I think was like one of the first ones with a remote that had looked like a TV remote, had like numbers on it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting that even after 40 years, it's maybe because the video game industry has developed so fast over that time that you guys are just keeping up, trying to just continue to make amazing stuff. And it requires so much pivoting and improvisation.
Yeah. I mean, games have gone leaps and bounds with, what they can do visually, orally, narratively, everything in games is more or less exploding over,
Hmm.
it's still, but look, over the last several years, from the 8-bit stuff that our generation played growing up to what we experience now, it's night and day different.
Do you have a proudest moment or moments from your career?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely things I look back on and say I still feel good about that. Oh, that's cool. I mean, I guess you could say, like, nominations and awards are in that category. Those are always
Mhm.
cool. I think the things though that I always look back on and feel the best about are the piece of music that I wrote, that I look back on and I'm like, I still like that piece.
Okay.
Those are always good.
When you listen back to your old stuff, how often, what percentage of the time are you like, oh, that was really nice? And what percentage of the time is like, ugh, that sucked?
Most of the time I'm like, I'm not like, oh, that sucked. There's a couple where I'm like, oh, I still don't like that cue. And some of the
Okay.
people I work with know which one I'm talking about. But most of them, I'll listen back to and like, oh, that's cool. I wish I had been able to spend a little more time polishing this or that or the other thing. But like, yeah, the piece is fine. But there's a few of them that, you listen back to and you're like, oh, I really like the way that came out. And those are, I guess you could lump those in with proudest moments kinds of things. But yeah, I guess it just depends. Like they say with most things creative, you don't really ever finish. You just have to stop. And so at some point it's like, okay, I'm that's it.
Right. If aside from like, oh, I wish I had done that cue differently, looking over like the arc of your career, how you got to where you are now, would you do anything differently?
I don't think I could and actually reproduce the result. It just, the combination of opportunities and chance and the people you meet along the way and the things you enjoy doing, like, you can't really control something like that. I mean, I guess possible things that if I had done differently, could have totally thrown me in a different trajectory. Let's say I moved to like New York City instead of LA. I might not have gotten as into, TV and film and records, and I might have gone way into like jazz performance, and I might be playing right now, or, you know, total different career path could have happened because, you have to live and you have to follow the opportunities as they arise, especially if you want to do music or a specific thing, you're going to focus on those opportunities whenever they arise, so that you keep closer to the path you want to be on. And depending on where you are, like, that simple of a decision could totally throw you on a different trajectory that you never would expect. And like, so yeah, I guess no, I wouldn't change anything. um I'd be curious to see like what might have happened, but I don't know that I would want to change it.
Do you do you feel like when you were young, when you first got to LA, like you sort of had to feel like that's how it would go in terms of like I just kind of had to roll with it, or did you kind of think, oh, I can sort of control this. I'm gonna become this or that, or were you just sort of open to roll with it?
I mean, I knew what I wanted to do. But no, like, you can never control it. You just keep trying to do the thing, and if you don't give up, eventually you'll get there. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower. Control, I think, is an illusion in that regard. Like, you have none of
So true.
it. Your The only thing reactions you
Reactions
can
and your
control
choices
is,
and
and
your
that's hard
right,
enough.
right. Does from a music perspective, does the video game work kind of take up all of your creative time, or are there other things you're working on outside of that?
Yeah, these days I'm mostly focused on the video game stuff. I do a handful of little projects on the side, but nowadays, between work and family, like, there's not a lot of time for as much side project stuff, for multiple projects at the same time, like I used to do.
Mhm.
I think that's less about the fact that I work on video games and more about the fact that now I have a family, and that, takes a lot of
Right.
time and focus. So
If somehow magically like 2 or 3 hours appeared every night after your kids were in bed that you could work on anything you wanted to for like a few nights a week, is there something that you kind of like in the back of your head, like a wish list that you want to do?
yeah, and I peck away at some of those things sometimes. Definitely still kind of working on a handful of, like, I guess you could call them kind of songwriting production projects that are in different veins, different genres. Generally things with vocals and lyrics, and some of the stuff I used to do more of that I do less of now in games, because I get my fill of instrumental music from working on games, but there are certain types of instrumental music that I like to do that I might not get to do as much of through my day-to-day work. And so those things, and especially things that are outside of the normal day-to-day palettes, are the things I like to do in my free time.
All right, well, Skye, thank you so much for joining me. And I think this working in video games is so fascinating. It's one of those things a lot of people, they read a little bit about, but no one knows a whole lot about what's going on inside. So I think our listeners will be really fascinated to hear these details. I appreciate you sharing it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Joe. It's good to see you. Good to catch up, and I'm excited to see how this comes out.
You too. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Audible Genius podcast. Now, as you listen to these musicians' stories, you may find yourself wanting to make your own music. Or maybe you already can, but you feel the need to brush up on fundamentals, fill in some gaps. Well, I've got some super effective and engaging courses that help aspiring digital musicians find their voice and create music they love. And these courses are more than just a series of videos. They have interactive challenges in a music software environment where you actually create music as you go and get real experience. The first course I recommend is Building Blocks, where you'll learn beat composition and music theory in an online music studio. Check it out at audiblegenius.com. We also have Syntorial, an award-winning course on synthesis, where you'll learn how to create your own sounds with a synthesizer. Check that out at syntorial.com. And both of these courses are designed by yours truly and the team here at Audible Genius. So if you've ever had a desire to make your own music, I highly encourage you to check them out. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.